I was standing in the back row at the Concordance talks, the day War-Marshal Torek Van told the Earth delegation to sit down before the adults finished speaking. He didn't shout it. That was the thing about the Korvath. They didn't need to shout. Torek Van had scales the color of wet iron, and a voice like gravel settling, and he used it to call our warships scrap iron toys in front of 11 other delegations, and every one of them laughed, because the Korvath had spent 2 centuries building alliances the way other people build fences, high, and only ever facing one direction. Earth wasn't in the fence. Earth had shown up asking for a mutual defense clause, something small, something any 2 neighbors might sign, and Torek Van had looked at our envoy the way you look at a dog that's wandered onto the good furniture. Our envoy didn't argue. She thanked the chamber for its time, and we left, and nobody in that room ever thought about us again. I remember the walk back to the shuttle more than I remember the insult itself. Nobody spoke, and nobody needed to. We'd come with a modest proposal and a handful of frigates nobody was impressed by, and we went home having learned exactly how little that chamber thought we were worth. It wasn't the kind of thing you forget. It wasn't the kind of thing you're supposed to act on either, and for 3 years we didn't. I thought about that day a lot, 3 years later, standing in the open hatch of a dropship over Vantir, watching the planet come up gray gold through the canopy in the flat morning light. I'm Staff Sergeant Callan Reeve, 3rd Expeditionary Marine Corps, and I've spent my whole career being underestimated by species with better tailors than sense. I didn't come to Vantir to enjoy it, none of us did, but I won't pretend some part of me didn't remember Torek Van's face when the order came down. The Korvath call it the threshing host, a marauder fleet that doesn't conquer worlds, just strips them, hull plate and topsoil and anything that burns, and moves on to the next one. It had been eating its way through the Korvath's outer colonies for 6 weeks, by the time Vantir sent its mayday, and here's the part that should tell you everything about how that summit went. They didn't send it to us. They sent it to every ally they'd courted instead of Earth, the Ilvain Concord, the Reth Compact, 4 systems that had sat in that chamber laughing along with Torek Van. Every one of them found a reason not to come. Treaty language, logistics. One system cited insufficient standing and left it at that. The Korvath had built a fence facing every direction except ours, and when the thing on the other side of the fence finally came through, there was nobody home in any of the houses they'd trusted. The mayday that reached Earth wasn't even addressed to us. It was an open civilian distress band, the kind every ship in 100 systems is required to monitor whether anyone expects an answer or not. A comms tech on the frigate Ashgrove picked it up 11 hours after it went out, forwarded it up the chain out of nothing but procedure, and by the next morning, the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet had orders to break orbit over a world that had told us to sit down and shut up. Nobody argued about it. That's the part I want on record. There was no debate in the ready room about whether the Korvath deserved it. The captain read the order, said, "Get your teams briefed," and that was the whole conversation. We didn't come to make a point. We came because 100,000 people were about to be stripped off their own world along with the topsoil, and we had ships that could stop that, and that was the entire math. We broke atmosphere at dawn. I want to be specific about that, because it mattered later. Full daylight, gray gold sun over Vantir's capital, no cover of dark to hide what we were or weren't. The Ashgrove and 4 escort cruisers took position over the primary hangar field, while our evac transports came down low and slow, ramps already lowering before they touched deck, because every minute we spent looking impressive was a minute somebody spent still waiting on the tarmac. My squad hit the hangar bay running a head count, not a parade. Korvath ground crew stood frozen at their stations, scaled faces doing something I hadn't seen on a Korvath before. Not fear, not the flat contempt from the summit chamber, just a kind of arithmetic failure, like their whole species had built its worldview around us, never being the ones to show up, and now the sums didn't close. A Korvath deck officer, younger than the rest, kept staring at the escort cruisers through the hangar's open bay doors, as if he expected them to turn around and leave. I told him twice to move his line toward the ramp before he heard me. When he finally did, he asked, in the flat trade tongue every Korvath officer learns for off-world dealings, why we hadn't simply let the mayday sit unanswered a while longer, the way his own allies had. I told him the honest answer, that nobody on the Ashgrove had thought to ask that question, because the order to move didn't come with a debate attached. He didn't have anything to say back to that. He just started moving his people, faster than before. Further down the field, a Korvath medic was working through a line of wounded on stretchers, applying pressure dressings with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion rather than fear, and one of our own combat medics knelt beside her without a word and started matching her pace, dressing for dressing, until the line moved twice as fast. Neither of them spoke the other's language well enough for more than here and next and hold this, and neither of them needed to. That's the kind of thing that happens in a hangar bay when the job is bigger than the history behind it. I found Torek Vaughn at the edge of the field an hour in, standing alone near a bank of dead comm relays, watching his own evacuation happen around him like a man watching weather. He looked older than I remembered. 3 years in a siege will do that to anyone, even iron-colored scales. He didn't say anything when I walked up, and for a second, I thought about every version of what I could say back to him. I had 3 years of material, if I'm honest. I didn't use any of it. Your people are boarding in the wrong order, I said instead. Wounded first, then families, then everyone with 2 working legs. Get your officers organizing that instead of standing here. He looked at me like I'd handed him something heavier than he expected. You could have let the reply lag another day, he said. His voice had lost the gravel. No one would have known. We'd have known, I said, and went back to the head count. That was the whole conversation. No confession, no apology big enough for the room, no moment where he fell to his knees and I got to feel like the better species for watching it. I didn't want that, and neither did the fleet. We moved 41,000 people off Vantir's surface over the next 9 hours, while the escort cruisers held the orbital line against the threshing host's forward elements, and every one of those 41,000 walked up the same ramps on the same ships Torek Vaughn had once called scrap iron toys in front of a laughing chamber. I watched his own honor guard board late in the afternoon, the officers who'd stood behind him at the summit, who'd laughed loudest when he made his joke about our tailoring. They filed up the transport ramp in the gray-gold light without looking at each other, because there's a particular kind of quiet that happens when a person has to accept help from exactly the source they spent years insisting they'd never need. Nobody on our side said a word about it. That was the discipline the captain expected of us, and it was the only kind of dignity worth having in a moment like that. Not gloating, just doing the job and letting the moment speak for itself. Torek Vaughn was the last Korvath off the field. He stood at the base of the ramp longer than he needed to, one hand on the hull plating he'd once dismissed as scrap, and for a second, I thought he might finally say the thing everyone expects in stories like this. Some grand admission, some vow. He didn't. He just nodded once, to me and to the ship both, and went up the ramp into the dark of a hold that had come a long way to carry him. I filed my report that night the way I file every report. Plain, factual, nothing dressed up. 41,106 evacuated. 0 Marine casualties. 3 cruisers holding station until the last transport cleared atmosphere. I left out the part where I stood on that ramp afterward, alone, and thought about a chamber full of delegates laughing at an envoy who never raised her voice. I didn't need to write that part down. Some of us were always going to remember it, whether it made the record or not, and some of us were finally starting to.